Hello and welcome to Planet Outlook. Air pollution is back in the headlines, and we are most likely going for another public health emergency this winter, especially in North India. To talk about the current situation, my guest today is Tanushree Ganguly. She is a program associate at the Council on Energy, Environment and Water, which is an independent, not-for-profit policy research institution. Thank you, Tanushree, for joining us on Planet Outlook.
Thank you so much, Ananda, for having me on the show. I've been an ardent follower of the series, and I'm super excited to be on the show and for this conversation.
So let's start with the current air quality, which has already moved into the hazardous category. And this is only in October this year. So how do you analyze the current situation, the haze and smog, which has taken over our kind of cities, mostly due to maybe stubble burning, but you know better?
So yes, I mean, this time we are seeing worsening of air quality earlier on in the season. And to an extent, of course, we can attribute it to stubble burning, which, as you might already know, we are seeing a higher fire count earlier on in the season. That is definitely one of the reasons. But in addition to that, it's also the local meteorology, which is kind of compounding the effect of this additional burden from stubble fires. So, I mean, typically, when we analyze air quality data, we don't look at only PM2.5 or PM10 data. We look at it in conjunction with certain meteorological parameters, which at this point in time, we are looking at wind directions. We're looking at wind speed. We're looking at the height of the planetary boundary layer, or mixing height as it's called. So what we are seeing is that, during the early mornings, especially leaning towards, let's say 12 noon, the mixing height is super low in Delhi right now, along with the surface wind speeds, which are again very low, which gives rise to something called calm conditions, which do not allow the mixing of pollutants with the air. So just imagine it's a box. So this is where your, pollutants are trapped. So it's not moving beyond that line. And that's why we can, sense and experience this haze. So of course, there is the existing local sources, which, there is dust, there is waste burning, there is vehicles, there is industries, power plants, which are in the vicinity of Delhi. And then there is this additional burden coming in from crop fires, which are happening in the northwestern states of Punjab, Haryana, and Western Uttar Pradesh. So everything coming together, it's just like a disastrous, deadly cocktail, which we are witnessing in the experience in the form of the haze and the smog.
So what ails basically air quality if somebody wants to manage the air quality kind of thing? So what's ail our basically system? So you have been critical of the government's plan, especially on smog towers, which the government is very keen on putting up. So what's your take on this?
So there are multiple issues. Actually, air quality management is not just air quality management, right? It's one of the primary challenges of urban governance, because if you look at air quality in itself, it's getting impacted by dirty vehicles. It's getting impacted by dirty fuels, which is being used in industries. It's getting impacted by usage of solid fuels by households for domestic, cooking or space heating, which we'll see in winters. It's getting affected by agricultural policies. So basically, it's a multitude of issues which need to be addressed for air quality to improve. So, of course, our recent report, which talks about the city action plans, we comment and we comment on the robustness of the clean air plans. So if I just look at that report and I outline the points that we've mentioned in those reports, it starts with information sources.
So let me interrupt you here. We'll come to this new report a little later, but you mentioned agricultural the parameters. Earlier, one of your reports basically talks specifically on stubble burning. So if I can go back a little and analyze what trends have you noticed from the earlier years to this year, and then we can take it forward to your new report.
No, sure. This year is particularly interesting, okay, because one is there is an increase in the availability of implements. So if you look at, the implements which are on ground, at least with the custom hiring centers or in the state of Punjab especially, compared to 2 years back, it's much higher. So as per our estimates for the state of Punjab, some 35,000 happy seeders are needed. Now, when I say implements, I'm not just talking about happy seeders. I'm talking about rotavators, I'm talking about mulchers, croppers, happy seeders. And this year's addition, which was basically tried out last year, I think it's the super seeder, which has been introduced, expensive compared to the happy seeder, but also more effective. So a range of implements have been rolled out. The other thing is the area under paddy this year. So the area under paddy compared to 2018 has gone down by 10 to 15%. So some 31 lakh hectares were under paddy in 2018. This year it's 27 lakh hectares. So we're going to see reduction in the stubble eventually generated. Then something interesting that has happened this year is that instead of traditional transplantation of rice, a lot of farmers have actually opted for direct seeding of rice. Now, direct seeding, one, is less water intensive and also less labor intensive. Now, it's interesting because there are three factors that we are seeing which can potentially, impact the amount of stubble which is getting generated this season. But again, just because there are more implements on ground does not necessarily mean that there will be increased utilization of paddy stubble. So yeah, if you ask me for my sense of this season's burning, and especially because we're also seeing higher fire counts already in Punjab earlier on in the season, I think we will see lower number of fires and they'll be more scattered throughout the season. Now, this is interesting because what happens is that the fires peak typically in the first week of November, right? And when they peak, we are looking at some 3,000, 4,000 fire counts in a single day. What we're seeing right now is some 1,500 fires. That's the highest, the daily fire counts. I'm talking only about Punjab has hit. So compare that, like 1,500 fires versus 4,000 to 5,000 fires in a single day. But still, that additional burden, along with the local meteorological conditions, is of course worsening Delhi's air quality. But our assessment of the conditions in hand, we still feel that the fires will be slightly lower compared to the previous season, and they'll be scattered. And we've written about it in one of our recent opinion pieces also.
But is technology the only solution? Because it seems to be very expensive for the marginal small farmers. Plus, it doesn't create room, the window between the summer crop and the winter crop. So still the gap is low in terms. So farmers just for kind of 2 weeks doesn't want to spend this amount of money. So where do you kind of look at this in the future? Do we need a drastic agricultural policy change or something different? Because obviously an environmental policy has created this problem, which is pushed back the kind of the rice harvest. So if you see on a holistic level, so where do we kind of look in the future years?
So honestly, in the long term, if we are looking for a solution to the problem of stubble burning, it has to be crop diversification. One, of course, is the fact that paddy in itself is a very water intensive crop. So it is resulting in decline in water table levels in the state of Punjab, right? So eventually we have to move away from paddy. And this year we've seen that. We've seen, the area under cotton has gone up, the area under maize has gone up. So the state needs to move away from paddy. That's the only solution. But the problem is the minimum selling price or the minimum support price, which is provided for the other crops. It's still, the MSP is still highest for paddy and wheat. And that's why farmers are reluctant to move away from this cycle. So any agricultural policy that we frame, it has to keep in mind the environmental repercussions it's going to have, which clearly did not happen with, pushing the harvesting season in order to save water. So there's still paddy harvesting happening, which is resulting in declining water tables, but it is also compounding the, adverse air quality problems, which Delhi typically faces during the winters. Now, the other interesting thing, which I think is worth discussing is this 2,500 rupees per acre, which farmers were supposed to be given. So the Supreme Court ordered the Punjab government to actually financially assist the small and marginal farmers who were going to cultivate non-basmati paddy and were not going to burn. So they were supposed to get incentivized for not burning. Unfortunately, that did not happen. Very few of the farmers actually got the 2,500 rupees per acre. So a lot of farmers are also of the opinion that, if this money was provided to us beforehand, before the harvesting season itself, then, potentially so many burning incidents would not have happened. So yeah, I mean, it's policy, it's, whether the state itself is budgeting that kind of money from the get-go to aid this problem. And, again, there are the legal orders which the state government needs to assist with. So yes, it's a messy cocktail, difficult to make sense of, but of course, in the long run, it has to be crop diversification.
So let's come back to this year's report, which you were mentioning, kind of thing. We were very critical about the National Clean Air Plan, that we don't have any budget. I think you also kind of flagged the data issue. So tell us about your...
So basically, I strongly maintain that we've not been critical of the plans. We've just highlighted a bunch of opportunities which, state pollution control boards need to take upon and just, buckle up. It's a vast challenge, and we completely acknowledge that. It's the first time that so many cities, 100 plus cities in the country, have all framed clean air plans. I mean, of course, it possibly was to just comply with this NGT order, which wanted state pollution control boards to put together these plans, but at least, there is a first document. Now, once we reviewed the documents, we realized that the problem is extremely deep-rooted. Now, initially when we started off this conversation, I talked about the multi-sectoral nature of the problem. But the problem is also the lack of data across different sectors. So if I just look at air quality for that instance, one, of course, is the monitoring data, which is, you're measuring the amount of pollution in the atmosphere. Second is the amount of load which is coming from different kinds of sources. So for that, you need like a basic accounting of how many vehicles are in the city, how many vehicles are coming from outside, what kind of vehicles are there, what fuels, these vehicles are using. So for estimating the load in a city, you need comprehensive database management. And that's the first point that we have highlighted. It's not just about taking stock of monitored data. You also have to take stock of these indicators, which eventually then go into estimating the total pollution load in your city. Now, if you don't have this, it's very difficult to assess, which is that activity which I need to prioritize, because cities have a limited budget. They need to figure out, okay, these are the areas where we need to spend, and we need to spend extensively. I mean, my personal opinion, cities need to spend on public transport, non-motorized transport, and waste management, hands down. These are the three things that they need to spend on. But they need to prioritize, okay, this is going to be my big ticket item this year, and that's what I'm going to spend on. And that is something that we did not see in the plans. And, we've looked at states like Uttar Pradesh and Rajasthan, which are 15 and 5 non-attainment cities respectively. If you look at Uttar Pradesh's 15 city action plans, every plan is the same. And I'm not saying that Uttar Pradesh is not working towards improvement in air quality. There's a lot of work that Uttar Pradesh is doing. But unfortunately, the plan does not reflect that work. Again, if you look at Maharashtra's plans are a little better than the rest of the states. Some of the cities have actually put in budgets for their plans. Some of the cities also have, results from source apportionment and emission inventory studies. So there are two problems here. One problem is that if you have a framework for preparation of the plans, every city is going to have the same plan. But if you don't have a framework for the plan, then the plans are not going to be up to the mark. So it's a very typical, it's a difficult problem for, state pollution control boards to address, given the fact that this is the first time that they're doing it. And that's why we say that, of course, the NGT ordered the SPCBs to put together these plans and submit it. But there has to be a systemic change, where preparation of these plans and a periodic review of these plans is essentially mandated. So cities do it, let's say, every 2 years. They look at the PM2.5, NOx, and other pollutant levels in the city and see that, hey, we've been able to control this pollutant by a certain extent. This pollutant, on the other hand, it's still high. It's not meeting the standards. So this is what we need to do. This has to be a periodic process. Every 2 years, they review the plan, they update it. Every 2 years, they see that, okay, this is the budget that the state government is allocating to pollution mitigation activities, and this is where we need to spend it. So it has to be a more rigorous process than it is right now. It just can't be a one-time exercise.
But where will the data come from? When I look at the figures, Delhi has 4 times the number of monitoring stations than a Mumbai or a Chennai. Calcutta has fewer, maybe other cities have maybe 1 or 2 maybe. So how do you see this thing kind of panning out?
So, I mean, data is a critical challenge. I mean, hands down. I was actually, right before we were going to speak today, I just thought that I look at the very recent numbers. And what I'm saying is that 800 plus manual monitoring stations in the country, okay? And there are only 200 something continuous monitoring stations, and for 114 cities only. Now, if you look at the number of non-attainment cities in the country right now, it's 122. And we don't have, there are non-attainment cities which don't even have a single continuous monitoring station. Now, the idea of having continuous data is to actively tell citizens that, okay, you know what, the pollution levels are super high right now. It's best for you to not venture out. So that data also is limited in the country today. Now, what has happened with, especially with the 15th Finance Commission recommending funds for air quality improvements across the city, and, even in the union budget, the Honorable Finance Minister declaring 4,400 crores for million plus cities, the million plus cities, of course, are going to see an increase in the monitoring infrastructure and augmentation of the monitoring infrastructure. But we still are not targeting, the peripheral areas. For example, if I'm not going to monitor Dharuhera, if I'm not going to monitor Ghaziabad as much as I monitor Delhi, I'm not going to be able to understand from where in Ghaziabad is the pollution coming from. So yes, I think we have to be very strategic about where we are placing the monitors also, because if you remember, the first real-time monitoring stations in Kolkata were in the Victoria Gardens and near Rabindra Bharati University, potentially the cleanest areas in Calcutta. So it's not just about increasing the number of monitoring stations, it's also about very strategically positioning these monitors. So of course, you need to get the background levels, you need to get the levels in residential areas or where there are a lot of people, so that we know that what is the quality of air that people are breathing. You need to have monitors in industrial areas. You need to have monitors in areas where there is a lot of mushrooming of construction sites. There has to be fence line monitoring. You have to monitor near the highways and the roads where a lot of vehicular pollution is. So there has to be an increase in the number of monitors, and they have to be placed very strategically across the city. So that's one part of the data story. The other part of the data story that I was talking about is the indicators. And this also goes into, it's like a feedback system. You need to monitor a few things. They're like KPIs. They're like, key performance indicators, that how is this sector performing when it comes to emissions, air pollution emissions. If I'm talking about waste management, I need to know in my city, these are the wards where all the households are actually giving the waste collector segregated waste. This is the amount of waste which is not actually, ending up in a landfill or eventually getting burnt. So I need that micro level data. If I'm planning a city for cleanliness, for better air, for better transport, I need to have these key performance indicators at the tip of my hands.
So you have reviewed the city plans, the over 100 cities which have kind of put on there. So do some of the cities plan to increase monitoring stations? What's the city plans look like? Do we see kind of focus on increasing stations? Because you also mentioned that there is practically no budget for kind of taking this plan in forward.
So yes, I mean, of course, there are cities, which do mention that we will increase our monitoring infrastructure, we'll augment our monitoring infrastructure. But that specificity, that, okay, between 2020, let's say from 2019 to 2021, we're going to increase the number of monitoring stations by XX number. That specificity is not there in the plans. And just on the budget bit, what I'm going to mention is that, of course, there are plans which have not outlined the budget, but then in 2019 to 2020, 28 priority cities were identified who were given central assistance to actually, perform certain kind of activities. And one of those activities was actually acquiring continuous monitoring stations, because these continuous monitoring stations are expensive. It could be 1.5 to 2 crores. So cities were provided central assistance for getting monitoring stations. And even with the flow of central assistance this year, as per recommendations by the 15th Finance Commission, cities are going to invest in getting more monitoring stations, because one, it's a very tangible solution. You're spending money, you're getting a monitor, you can showcase the data. A lot of investment that needs to go into for improving air quality is actually systemic. So, it's process oriented. You need to ensure there is better inspection, there is better enforcement, there are more people in your pollution control board. So there are systemic changes, but getting something like a monitoring station is a very tangible change. So to answer your question, yes, there were plans which did mention that they will increase the number of monitoring stations, but that specificity, and that's something that we've been recommending, that you know that this is the kind of money which is coming into you. So let's say you got 10 crores in 2019, 2020, you're getting another 50 crores in 2020, 2021. To what extent would you like to increase your monitoring stations, and how much would you budget for just augmenting the monitoring network?
So also the government has kind of announced that with the NCAP, the new plan, it will kind of clean up city air by 2024. Is this possible? Is this target achievable?
So the target right now is 20 to 30%. And the lockdown, it has shown us what needs to be done. We have to massively cut down emissions. Now, this is where the source information comes into play. Now, if all the cities actually had a baseline emission inventory, we would have very easily, been in a position to say that, okay, these are clearly the sources where you need extensive cut down on emissions. 20 to 30%, honestly, in my opinion, might not be that steep by 2024, provided cities put in concerted efforts. And I'd like to reiterate, the first cut of the plan is there. There is money coming in from the government to improve air quality management in cities. What's remaining is for all the agencies, and that's again a point that we raise in our report, which is about multiplicity of institutions who are involved in ensuring that the plan gets implemented. If all these agencies perform their functions to the T, then I think 20 to 30% is actually achievable. Plus, I'm an optimist, so I'm going to say yes.
But what do you think? What needs to change in this NCAP?
Right. What needs to change in the NCAP? I think the NCAP in itself is a solid document. All it needs is another implementation guide with it. And this is something that I've maintained from the very beginning. It lists down series of actions, okay? But what I think personally is missing is, again, it does tell you the timelines to do these activities, but how do these timelines actually percolate into the non-attainment cities? That is something which as an addendum needs to go with the NCAP. The NCAP document came out somewhere in the concept note for the NCAP document, for instance, came out, I think in April or May 2018. So cities took their time to actually process the document. Sorry, states took their time to process the document. Now, states got into the action mode only when the NGT directed them to put together these plans. So it cannot be, a very reactive process. Now, of course, this is going to be air quality management so-called preamble for the next 5 years. It was launched in 2019, and it's going to extend up to 2024. So, but one thing is that there has to be an NCAP review happening. Two, there has to be some kind of a legislative mandate associated with the NCAP. Now, it could be notified under, let's say, the environmental protection rules, the Air Act. Of course, the Air Act already has provisions it actually empowers the Central Pollution Control Board to plan a national level pollution control strategy. So I think that legislative teeth and backing is somewhat missing for the NCAP. The document in itself is fine. It talks about rural air pollution. It talks about satellite observations to aid air quality management. It's a very well-intended document, but the execution, implementation, the legal teeth, and of course, the money. These are the things which are still, the missing components.
But experts like you have said that the city-specific plan is not a good idea. You have to look at a regional level plan to clean up the 30-40%, whatever the targets is. So your thoughts on that?
So when we were putting together the document, and of course we put it together along with urban emissions, and urban emissions maintains something called the Apna emission database, and we looked through the emission database to see what is the ballpark contribution from sources which are outside the city limits, and on an average we found that it's close to 30%. So if you're only looking at the city, the local sources, you're still missing out a major piece of the puzzle. So yes, I mean, the city-specific approach might not be the best approach. You have to look at a regional approach, but that again involves, identifying the airshed where interstate collaborations are needed. So for Delhi, it's set, we look at the Delhi NCR, some amount of pollution coming from Punjab, Haryana, Western Uttar Pradesh, and okay, this is the perfect airshed that we need to manage. But we also need to start following other regions more closely as to understand that what are these airsheds. Or we could just, look at existing ways in which the country is split up. We could look at agroclimatic zones. We could look at, just climatic zones. So one is, of course, identifying that, to what extent a city gets affected by external sources. And typically, in states like Punjab, a lot of pollution is coming from outside. So again, I think to answer your question, some cities might actually benefit from the city level approach, because if you come to, the regional level approach, there might be a lot of blame shifting. So on some levels, the city level approach works, because at the end of the day, you have to take ownership of the sources within your boundary. But yes, I mean, if you look at the way plans need to be made, the regional component definitely needs to be accounted for.
Is this, we are looking at a North-South divide? Because when I see the pollution map, the Gangetic, the area of the plain is the most polluted. Even in terms of life expectancy, we are seeing a double kind of thing from the rest of the Indian average. So do you think South India is much better off, because all our pollution talk is all concentrated to Delhi, Punjab, Haryana, especially the North India, UP?
Well, I think, just because we talk more about pollution in North India does not mean, the southern part of the country is not particularly polluted. For example, there is this Ennore thermal power plant, which is one of the highest SO2 emitters in the country. And it's very close to Chennai. Unfortunately, Chennai is not a non-attainment city. So I think a lot of missing data is also playing into this issue of, more focus on the North Indian cities. And also because, not in all North Indian cities, I think the focus has typically been Delhi for years. So I think missing data is playing into this, I don't know, I would say an imaginary divide between pollution levels in the North and South.
Because I see my South Indian friends always point fingers that you live in the most polluted region, kind of thing.
No,
so also
I really...
during the lockdown, one of the things... Yeah, carry on.
No, I was just saying that, yeah, this definitely can be attributed to data limitations. I mean, North India is way more monitored. Of course, Bengaluru is well monitored, but I still feel that the North Indian states are way more well monitored in terms of real-time monitoring infrastructure, of course.
So one of the things also which came out in the lockdown is the ground level ozone. So when we talk about air pollution, we kind of limit ourselves to particulate matter of PM2.5, PM10. But this is kind of the first time during the lockdown, the ground level ozone kind of level shot up. How worried are you on this aspect?
So actually, during summers, we typically see an increase in ozone. And of course, this time it became more evident. I mean, I don't want to pick out a pollutant to be worried about. And I mean, this talks about the kind of chemistry which goes on in the atmosphere. I mean, ozone is basically a secondary pollutant, and NOx and VOC emissions are precursors to ozone. And we did see that, with decline in NOx emissions, because that was very steep, we see an increase in ozone emissions. So yeah, I mean, here, I think the rise in ozone, so what we're seeing here, it's an interesting, conundrum, because typically the NOx levels are at a certain limit, which kind of keeps the ozone levels in check. But now that we saw NOx levels coming down, we are seeing a rise in ozone. So of course, I'm concerned about it, but it also is reflective of the kind of chemistry which goes on in our atmosphere.
Also, the WHO guidelines are much stricter than any country follows. We follow a very watered down kind of parameters on PM 2.5, PM 10. So what do you think on this? Should we be more stricter? Because it seems we are not kind of getting into any kind of standards.
Right. No, that's a good question, actually. But, talking feasibly, even if we look at, the lockdown as the datum level, because that's the most ideal situation that we'll potentially ever see, where most of the emissions are at an absolute check, right? Even during the lockdown, the average PM 2.5 levels were, especially in the northern part of the country, which infamously is more pollutant than the southern part of the country, it was in the 40 to 50 microgram per meter cube range, right? So if you compare that to the WHO standards for PM 2.5, which is 10 and 25, so 10 annual and 25 or 24 hour, so it's still more than that. So what I'm saying is, even in the most ideal situation, we're still looking at 40 to 50 microgram per meter cube. So I think that our levels, given the background concentrations of pollutants, are of course less stringent than the WHO standards, but are potentially more feasible. So you see, I mean, of course, 60 microgram per meter cube is the daily average, but on the long, if I'm looking at my annual average, it's still 40 microgram per meter cube. So even if I'm seeing, summer conditions are more congenial for pollutant dispersion, and again, there were rains also during the lockdown period, and then there were emissions cut down during the lockdown period. So even in the most favorable of setups, we're still seeing, pollution PM 2.5 concentrations of 40 to 50 microgram per meter cube range. So I think, yeah, I mean, getting to the WHO standard might be possible, but given that our background concentrations are still high, because, especially in the Indo-Gangetic Plain, we see loose alluvial dust. So, so that might be a little tricky. But anyway, we're still looking at 150, 110 microgram per meter cube. Getting down to 60 is really looking like an uphill task at this point in time.
So my last question, and then I come back to Delhi and the central government. Both the central government and the Delhi government thinks smoke towers are a silver bullet to solve our clean air. And you've been very critical of this plan. And not only you, all of the air pollution experts in the country. So spending 20 crores of taxpayers' money, is it the right way to go? And why do you think smoke towers do not work?
So, I mean, I can go on and on about smoke towers. One, I mean, the first reason that hits my mind is that what you're essentially saying is that, hey, polluters, go on polluting, we'll clean up the air. I mean, we're not really cleaning up the air, but we will clean up the air by, installing this tower. So it's encouraging that mentality. So where the mentality should be polluters, you gotta pay, by installing a smoke tower, you're encouraging the mentality, polluters, you can pollute. So fundamentally, it's a wrong idea. Second, now, if I look at the smoke tower, it's basically an indoor air purifier with a much higher clean air delivery rate. Now, when we are buying indoor air purifiers, and the market for indoor air purifiers has gone up, in Delhi a lot in the last 2-3 years. So if you look at an indoor air purifier, what you typically do is, so the retailer will tell you, ki, Acha, it will give you so much clean hawa, and if this is the size of your room, you can install it in your room and you will be fine. Now we can do that with an indoor setting because the amount of volume that a room can contain is fixed. And of course, I mean, I'm going to shut down all the doors and windows. There'll be zero ventilation and I'll run my purifier. ठीक है, बहुत बढ़िया. You're going to get clean air. But now you're taking this setup to the outside and you're going to place that tower where, thousands of vehicles are constantly moving by. You have waste burning somewhere, within 20 kilometers. You have pollution coming in from the nearby states. So basically, how are you going to account for this massive amount of air which is flowing in from everywhere? It's practically very difficult to design or to simulate these outside conditions to design the TAR. So that's one of my primary concerns with the TAR. And the second thing is, let's say, for 1 second, let's just think that yes, smog TAR is the solution. Now, how many of these TARs would we actually need? So when the tower in Lajpat Nagar was installed, we kind of looked at the technical specifications of the TAR. So, I mean, reportedly it can clean up to 250,000 to 600,000 meter cubes per day. Now think of Delhi's airshed. It's 1489 square kilometers. And the mixing height that I talked about, it varies from, let's say, 100 meter to 2,000, 2,500 meter. That's millions of meter cubes of air per unit time. So if we were to put a number to the amount of smog TARs that would be needed, it would run into millions. Our estimate at that point in time was 2.5 million smog TARs. And I personally feel that that's the bare minimum that would be needed. Now, even when you actually place it, at one area and you say that, okay, ki localized pollution hai, localized pollution clean karega. But if you look at the clean air which is coming out of the smog TAR, it starts waning out. So its effectiveness might actually be super high within, let's say, 5 to 10 feet of the TAR. But if your residents live way beyond the TAR, let's say, 15, 20 feet, they're practically not getting any clean air. And, I mean, the TAR, which was installed in Xi'an, because that's where the inspiration came from, it's been installed for 3 years now. I think it was installed in 2016, so over 3 years now. But of course, they've put out papers on numerical simulations where they say that, okay, if we put 8 towers along the 6th ring road of Beijing, then we'll see so much reduction in Beijing. But they're all numerical simulations. We don't have actual results of the impact of that single tower which was there in Xi'an. So yeah, I mean, it's definitely a non-solution and an unnecessary expense. And I mean, I definitely like to say that there are a lot of competing, avenues where this money is better spent. I think I read in the newspaper a week or 10 days back that the Delhi Pollution Control Committee is hugely understaffed. I mean, I don't know, for just inspections, monitoring and enforcement, the team has 37 people only. It could use a lot of funds to kind of scale up the number of people it has. And I mean, you would have seen the Swachh Survekshan results, EDMC and SDMC just languishing at the bottom of the ranks. So yeah, I think the money is better spent elsewhere.
Thank you so much, Tanushree Ganguly. I hope policymakers and our administrators are listening to you. And I hope to kind of see you very soon as we progress in the winter months with your new thoughts on how we have been kind of battling this air pollution menace. So thank you again and stay safe. Hope to see you soon.
Thank you so much, Ananda, for having me. This was a great conversation. Thank you so much.